Mr Speaker, that presentation deserves and requires a response. Firstly, I think the underlying assumption behind the statement of this bill is that the current sentencing regime does not take into account an assault on a police officer or a corrections officer as an aggravating factor. That would be the assumption you could take by reading this particular piece of legislation, and I want to say that is completely wrong. Completely wrong. If you go out on the street and talk to anybody on the street and ask them, are you more likely to get into trouble if you assault a police officer or a corrections officer? And the answer will be unanimously yes. The second thing which I think is wrong with this piece of legislation, and that is the implication that the judiciary have not been taking into account an assault on a police officer or a corrections officer when they're making their decisions. And I think that is completely wrong as well. In some ways, it could be interpreted as this bill is a slur on the integrity and the decision-making of our judiciary. It could be taken that way because what it says, by implication, that the assault on a police officer or a corrections officer is not being taken into account now, and Parliament is so concerned about it not being taken into account now that the Parliament is going to pass a law requiring the judiciary to undertake this, to do this, to take this assault on a police officer or correction officer as an aggravating factor because they have not been doing it to date. Well, I want to say to the government, that's not correct. That is not correct. Any simple analysis of the decisions of the judiciary will show that, in fact, the judges have been doing that to date. So if the judges have been doing it to date, and it is an aggravating factor, what is the motivation for this piece of legislation? Well, there are many things that come to. It could be that it's simply about politics. And Jonathan Young gives us the clue into this. Jonathan Young asserts in this House that this legislation is necessary to protect police officers and corrections officers from assault. Very powerful assertion, but what he doesn't do is then say how this legislation will do that. Nothing there at all. There's no analysis, no logic, no process to show that this piece of legislation will fulfil his assertion that the legislation is there to protect police officers and corrections officers. Now, anybody reading the legislation will see that it does not. This is not a defensive piece of legislation. This is a piece of legislation which will take effect after the prospective assault on either a police officer or a corrections officer. Now, for Jonathan Young's proposition to have any effect, then a person who's contemplating assaulting a police officer or a corrections officer must think in a logical way like this. I'm about to assault a police officer. This is different from another person in the public. The National Party have passed a piece of legislation, or Parliament's passed a piece of legislation saying this is going to be an aggravating factor when I'm up for charge, if I'm detected, prosecuted and convicted, and then working out what it's likely to be the cost of the tariff to me for an ordinary assault, plus the aggravating circumstances now that Parliament has passed it. Maybe this is not a good idea. Well, I have to say to the National Party and Jonathan Young that no one goes through that calculation when they're about to embark upon a crime. An assault on a police officer or murder is an irrational act. It's not an act of a rational person, and so a rational calculation is simply unthinkable. I want to say to the National Party that when they claim that Labor doesn't support this and doesn't care, I disagree with that absolutely. That is a slur on the Labor Party. We are as offended as anybody else at assaults on the police. We are offended as anybody else about assaults on our corrections staff. To imply that we are not is simply wrong, and it's simply politics to do so. I want to say that to them that, like the rest of our community, we value the role that our police staff do in protecting our communities. In fact, our record shows that we had a record increase in the number of police staff and investment in police. Any analysis will show that, to make our communities safer. And the Labor Party does not tolerate violence in our community. Now, having said that, I want to also make another observation. There is an important process happening here now. Parliament is passing more and more legislation that puts obligation on judicial decisions. And I think in some way this is part of parliamentarians really wanting to be court judges. They say they're unhappy with it, so we're going to fix it by passing laws to require the judges to make decisions. And I want to say to the National Party that this is getting closer and closer to impinging upon the freedom of judges to make decisions. Our democracy is based on the separation of the powers, and one of them is that the legislation, one power is the power of Parliament to legislate, and the second is the power of the judiciary to make independent decisions. We, in passing this legislation in conjunction with 3 strikes, in conjunction with other pieces of legislation, are now in danger of getting closer and closer to having judicial decisions made by simply filling in an equation box. And in doing that, we are restricting, in some ways, the independence of the judiciary to make independent decisions. Now, if parliamentarians want to become judges and want to be imposing sentences, I suggest to them that they get a law degree, serve in the legal profession for a while, and then apply to become a court judge. If the person doesn't want to be a judge and wants to pass statutes, well then they join a political party and come here and we pass laws. There are 2 separate things. Parliament is not here to restrict the independence of independent judicial decision making. So having said that, Mr. Speaker, I want to come back to summarise the points that we've made. It's our contention, and everything on the public record will show, that judges today take into account an assault on a police officer or a corrections officer as an aggravating decision. They do it today. That the implication from this legislation is that the judges don't, and I reject that. The implication from the National Party is that this is going to make people safer, and I don't agree with that. Because there's been no analysis shown, particularly by Jonathan Young, who I listen to very carefully and is usually a thoughtful member of contributors to this House, in making the assertion that it's going to protect police officers. He offered no analysis and no logic to show that that was to be the case. But it does send, the value in this legislation is it does send a statement of intent. And for that purpose, because it is about a statement of intent in many ways, the Labor Party will support this bill going to the Select Committee. Mr. Speaker, I think I've said enough, and it's welcome to see you here on this fine Wednesday morning.
Chris Tremaine.